admiral who is in charge of intelligence briefings for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the world's largest military. So before I went to that meeting with him, with Edgar Mitchell, who I invited as a guest, and some other people, I gave him this document. Well, this admiral got hold of this particular cell, which is a black operation, and he said, I'm Admiral Wilson of the Joint Staff Intelligence. I'm in charge of intelligence for the Joint Staff, and I'd like to be read into, which is military speak for briefed. I want to be read into this project. And they said to him, well, sir, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know. And he said, well, damn it, how can I not have a need to know? I'm the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they said, sir, we will not discuss this with you. Click, hung up on him, and then blocked his line. Now, this I know for a personal fact. This is not a conspiracy theory. So this is something that in Europe, when the French delegation that we received heard these stories, and not only heard them from me, but heard them confirmed by Commander Miller and our military advisors and our science advisors and people with PhDs and long histories in Washington, they went, this is horrible and fascinating, but how can this be? I said, you're not listening to me. There's been a coup d'etat for 50 years and running in the United States on this issue. And that's why people don't seem to get it, that there is sort of a parallel secret government that runs this stuff, and if they don't like who the CIA director happens to be, they won't tell him anything. Now, there are other CIA directors, such as George Bush Sr., who was fully involved in with it. But like Woolsey, who was Clinton's CIA director, knew nothing. Same thing with Secretary of Defense Cohen. So it really is fascinating, and I think that one of the things I've had to educate the Europeans on, this is where I'm getting to with this, is the way you throw away your civics history books and your civics lessons from high school, because that isn't how these super secret projects run. They run on another level from Mount Olympus. They're sort of, they're the masters of the universe that run in a different way. And it doesn't matter if you're the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense or the CIA director or what your rank or privilege is, even in Washington and even in the Pentagon, if they don't want you to know. And this is also what I got confirmed from. Do you remember this old gentleman in England, Paola, named Lord Hill Norton? Absolutely, yes. Did you ever get to know him? No, I didn't, but I did see the clip on Out of the Blue. James Fox did an interview with him, and I did watch that. Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time with him, and of course he invited me to his home there. He had a beautiful country home in Hampshire, which is an area out a couple hours from London. And back some years ago, he invited me there. And, of course, he had been, if those of you who don't know who Lord Hill Norton was, he was a 5-star admiral, which they don't have anymore. They used to call them Sea Lords. And he was also the head of the Ministry of Defense for some years and head of the military committee for NATO. And the entire time that he was in those positions, he was never given any information on this subject. The fact that he confirmed to me as I met with him. Now, what was interesting, the reason he wanted to meet with me, he wanted to get from me the briefing I'd put together for the president, which, of course, I gave him. I'm not running anything secret here. I said, if you want it, here it is. If you're able to read, it's dispositive, and that's that. Of course, no one reads anymore, especially a 600-page thing. But he did. And I'm sitting with him in his parlor, and he's looking at me, and he finally looks up, and he's this little guy with piercing blue eyes, and he looks at me, and he says, what I want to know is why wouldn't they tell me about this when I was the head of the Ministry of Defense? And I said, well, let me answer your question with a question. And he looked rather peeved, but I wasn't trying to be cheeky. I just said, just hear me out, Admiral. And I said, what would you have done if you had found out that there was a cabal, a clique of people who knew about this, had figured out how UFOs operate, could have gotten us out of Mideast oil and into a free energy economy with no pollution and no poverty half a century ago? and that they were ruthlessly keeping it secret and lying to people in the constitutional chain of command and had engaged even up to and including murder to keep this. And he says, I wouldn't have stood for it for one bloody moment. And he was almost jumping up out of his chair. And I said, that's why they didn't tell you anything. And his eyes widened. I said, they don't want you to know this because they knew you're a good guy. You're a stand-up guy, Admiral. So Lord Hill Norton and I had this great conversation about this. I said, they'd first do a soul biopsy. They do an analysis to see if you're a good person who would like to benefit humanity. If you are, they're not going to tell you anything. If you're one of these devils who are interested in centralized power and maintaining the current hegemony in the world with the petrodollar and the fossil fuel system, then they'll bring you up through the system. It has nothing to do with your rank. And this is what the French people, when I was talking to them about what had happened in the United States and also in the United Kingdom, they were a little bit befuddled, and then they got it. And I have found that in smaller countries like in Denmark and other countries around the world, I said, well, one of the things you have to remember is that the United States of America has, if you add up our defense budget, Homeland Security, CIA, the other intelligence operations, National Security Agency, we're pushing $1 trillion a year. So between 100 and 200 billion of that $1 trillion a year is stolen, missing. It goes into black budget. No one has any idea. That's why we're in Rumsfeld right before 9/11 said there's $2.3 trillion missing out of the Department of Defense budget. And by the way, that clip is going to be in the movie Sirius. It's going to be amazing. We found the clip. It's going to be in there. And people go, did he mean trillion or billion? I said, no, he meant trillion. It's missing, unaccounted for. That's what we're talking about. And so now if you look at that number, Paula, if you were to look at the biggest defense budgets of any country in the world besides the United States, the amount that we have stolen or is lost into these black projects is larger than any other defense budget in the world. Just the amount we lose. Not the amount we spend total, the amount we lose that we can't keep track of. So this is what these people I need to sit down with some of these folks and explain how the world really works when you're talking about this kind of power and money and defense spending and intelligence operations, because there's no frame of reference in Europe or in Italy for this. I mean, they just can't quite wrap their mind around it. It took about a week for the French to wrap their mind around this. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from. Explaining this to you, see it so clearly. Everyone asks, and everyone has asked me in Europe, why is the secret secret? Right. And when I tell them it has nothing to do with aliens, it has nothing to do with sightings, it has nothing to do, it has to do with economics, and it has to do with the energy system. You know, what's being hidden is not the idea that we are not alone. I think that that's plausible. I mean, if you do the archaeology, it's plausible. It's all the rest.
Right. Yeah, but one thing backs into the other. In other words, I was talking to someone once about this. They said, yeah, but if you acknowledge that we've been visited, then people will say, well, is it likely we are being visited now and that these UFOs are real? The answer is going to be yes. And then people are going to say, well, gee, I wonder how they're moving from one star system to another. They're certainly not using Exxon Jet A fuel, and they're certainly not using rockets circa 1942 from Wernher von Braun. They're using a whole trans-dimensional physics system, which have been studied and asked and answered. I mean, that question has been asked, and it was answered in the 40s and 50s. And the problem becomes, if you acknowledge the reality of the subject at all, then you're stepping into this area of what the title of my autobiography is Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, because this is the hidden truth and the forbidden knowledge that is absolutely you're not supposed to talk about. And the best way they can do it is to just ridicule it, so that friends like your friend Mario just encounters all this ridicule. But that was also done deliberately by the CIA. They launched a program in 1953. I have a document that describes their engaging Disney Studios to do cartoons and make levity of the whole flying saucer, little green man thing, so that it would become a subject of ridicule and no one of stature would take it seriously. And that actually was a very effective intelligence operation, and it is running to this day, as you can tell from the rubbish that comes out of Hollywood.
Yeah, I think we owe it to people like Gordon Cooper, don't you, though, Steve, to go ahead and keep at it. People say, why do you keep at it? Why are you still doing this? Why? It's because we owe it to people like Gordon Cooper, who was also involved in the 1979 attempt with the United Nations with Grenada.
Right.
Gordon Cooper was there with Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée and Leo Stringfield, who was an amazing researcher.
Right.
These people, Lee Spiegel was responsible for that, and there was an attempt to go through the United Nations. I mean, maybe if United Nations can't do it, maybe the EU can do it. A group of international people that will have a dialogue, because what Mr. Borghesio told me was, he said, we need to begin a dialogue, and that's what really impressed me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, has happened intermittently, and that's why I keep saying that these big governmental institutions need to have people who are in them, like your friend, to lead the charge. But they're also going to, at a certain point, run into a buzzsaw, as there's a book that Gore Vidal wrote the foreword for called Into the Buzzsaw, and it's about how people who stumble across certain really hot topics end up getting cut down. And I remember, I don't know if you remember, back in the 90s, there was a UN Secretary General named Boutros Ghali, and he and his wife were very interested in what we were doing and invited me up to New York, and I did a briefing at the UN for a group there, and Mrs. Boutros Ghali greeted me at the Great Hall of the UN and took me by my arm, and I had my second daughter with me, and we're walking through the Great Hall. And she turns to me and hisses, and this was not the first time I had met her, but she says, when are you going to get this done? Now, I'm just a country doctor in North Carolina rambling around in an ER and taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and burned victims and God knows what all. And she looks at me and says this. I said, what are you talking about? She says, this has to happen, this disclosure. I said, well, Leah, your husband is the head of the world. He's the head of the United Nations. He says, no, they'll kill Boutros. And I said, excuse me? And, of course, my daughter's right there and old enough to understand what she's saying. And I'm thinking to myself, what am I, chopped liver? And, of course, I am. Yeah, but, I'm going, oh, my God, you've got to be kidding me with this. So we have this meeting, but what we found was that eventually he got moved aside, and then Kofi Annan came in. Well, Kofi Annan agreed to hold the disclosure event we did at the National Press Club at the UN, in the general, where the Secretary General and the whole General Assembly meets. He got a visit, and some suits with an all-access pass came in and threatened him, and basically indicated that the money would be pulled and the UN would be bankrupt if he did such a thing. And so that UN initiative was shut down. And so that's when I had to do it at the National Press Club. Now, I've never told this story before, but that's how we ended up going from the UN to the National Press Club.
That is interesting.
Yeah. Oh, terrible. Terrible.
Well, it's also very powerful what you just said, because you've gone to the highest of the high to open these doors. And what I'm seeing now is that you're going to the people, and the people have the power. It's the people that really will open the doors.
You're right, and this is why we view this film. It's interesting, serious, this film that we wanted it finished in December, but we're delayed a couple months because, as you know, the director's father was shot in the back at that Sikh temple shooting, and also we're trying to get some more work done on this little E.T. Bean and get some genetic work done, but that's also gotten delayed because it's such a specialized endeavor. There's some specialized equipment having to be ordered and custom made, and et cetera, and so on. So, but we still hope to have this done somewhere, February, March time period. But what we're finding is that this has been funded by the people, and when it comes out, eventually we're going to want to see the people being as I said, you may have been there in March when I was at the the UFO conference in Phoenix just in last March in 2012, and I said, look, we want to do this, and everyone in this room and everyone listening right now on the World Puja